My husband requested a non-monogamous marriage after therapy, and I learned his coach had a history with him which ultimately completely changed everything forever. You know, my whole life, I imagined my world falling apart with some big, dramatic explosion. Like in a movie, you know? But instead, my entire life basically split in half on a random Tuesday night, over cheap fajitas and watered-down soda. And the man sitting across from me, my husband, was stirring ice in his glass like he was about to ask for extra napkins, not detonate our entire marriage. Can you even imagine that? The sheer, mind-numbing audacity of it all? I remember every excruciating detail. I was wearing this blue blouse that always made me feel a little more put together than I actually was, still had my clinic badge on because I'd rushed straight from work. And he looked at me, this calm, almost pitying look, like he was about to do me a favor instead of setting my soul on fire. He took this deep, deliberate breath, that fake calm smile he'd been practicing ever since he started his sessions with his life coach plastered on his face. And he said, really gently, that he'd been doing a lot of inner work. He finally understood, he told me, that he needed a relationship that was more expansive and aligned with his true self. That's when I knew. He wasn't just going to say he wanted a divorce. He was about to ask for something far, far worse. Now, before I tell you exactly what he asked for, I probably need to back up a little. Because none of this started with the fajitas. I work as an administrative coordinator at a medical clinic. Sounds fancier than it is. It's a lot of scheduling, insurance verification, calming down angry patients who think the world is ending because their appointment moved by 30 minutes. And trying not to scream when someone shows up without their paperwork for the third time. I'm good at it. Not because it's my dream job, but because I'm organized, and I know how to make people feel heard, even when I secretly want to roll my eyes. My husband used to say that was one of the things he loved about me, how I could walk into chaos and somehow make everyone feel calmer. And I used to believe him. Which is embarrassing now, but also kind of sweet if I can detach it from everything that came after. We'd been married for almost 5 years when he decided to reinvent himself. At first, it was small. He signed up for an online workshop about unlocking your potential and started following this life coach on social media, you know, the kind where everyone posts quotes over sunsets. He said she was different, that she really understood people. And I honestly didn't care. I figured it was a phase. Like that time he got obsessed with freezing smoothies, then forgot the blender existed 2 weeks later. Except this time, it didn't fade. He started going to in-person sessions with her every week, then twice a week. Then he joined this small men's group she ran, with an assistant who sent daily voice notes about being strong yet vulnerable and holding space for their inner boys. At first, I tried to be supportive. Who am I to get in the way if my husband wants to be happier or more aligned, right? I even went to one of her public talks. Sat in the back, still in my clinic scrubs, and watched as she walked around barefoot, talking about fear and passion and how we abandon ourselves in little ways every day. She was charismatic, I'll give her that. She had that kind of confidence that makes you feel like she's lived 10 different lives and figured something out in each one. My husband couldn't take his eyes off her. But I told myself that was normal. She was the speaker. He was taking notes. Nothing more. Looking back, that was probably the first time my stomach tightened in that specific way. But I ignored it. Because I didn't want to be the jealous wife who couldn't handle her husband admiring another woman's brain. The real shift started about 8 months before that Tuesday. He began repeating her phrases at home, almost word for word. My coach says comfort is the enemy of growth, he'd say, whenever I suggested we stay in on a Friday night. Or, she really sees who I am underneath all this conditioning, when I asked why he suddenly needed to spend every weekend at these 3-day retreats she hosted. He talked about her like she was some kind of mirror to his soul. And at first, I just rolled my eyes and sent memes about cults to my best friend. But then he started keeping his phone face down. He smelled like a perfume I didn't own. And he stopped touching me, unless it was to squeeze my shoulder while walking past, like we were colleagues sharing a break room. 3 months before the fajitas, I moved into the guest room. I told him it was because his snoring was bad and I needed sleep, which was technically true. But the bigger truth? Lying next to him, while he breathed out someone else's perfume, made me feel like my skin didn't fit. I'd already said goodbye to our marriage in my head more than once, but I didn't have the courage yet to say it out loud. Part of me was waiting for him to come to his senses, to wake up from this personal development fever dream and remember there was a person actually living with him, not just content for his next breakthrough. Another part of me was just tired. And when you're that kind of tired, you exist in this weird limbo. You're not really in or out. You're just holding your breath and calling it normal. So when he put his fork down that night, and said he wanted to talk about the direction of our relationship, I already knew something was coming. I just didn't expect the level of audacity. He leaned in, like we were in some romantic drama, and said he'd been exploring new frameworks for love and connection. He'd realized that he had outgrown traditional monogamy. And then he smiled and told me he wanted us to open the marriage, so we could both experience more passion and authenticity. Because apparently, this wasn't about him wanting to sleep with other people. Oh no. This was about my spiritual growth. He actually said that the coaching had helped him reconnect with a part of himself he'd buried since college. A part that knew what real passion felt like. And that he wanted me to experience that too, not just comfort. I remember staring at him, thinking, you are actually serious. You are quoting your life coach while suggesting I calmly accept being traded in like a rental car. And somehow you think you sound enlightened. I asked him, as calmly as I could, if this sudden desire for openness had anything to do with one specific person who sent him voice notes late at night. And he swore up and down it wasn't about anyone in particular. Oh no. It was about an energy he had been repressing. He said his coach was just helping him remember what it was like to feel truly alive. That she reminded him of who he was back when he was in school and not weighed down by expectations. And that him bringing this to me was a sign of respect, because he didn't want to cheat. And yes, he really said that. Like asking your wife for permission to emotionally detonate her life is somehow respectful. I didn't blow up right there. Even though part of me wanted to throw my drink in his face like a soap opera scene. Instead, I sat there, my hands shaking under the table, and I smiled in that automatic way I'd perfected with difficult patience. And I told him I needed time to think. He looked so relieved. Like he'd just successfully completed a negotiation. He paid the bill with our joint card, without even looking at me, while he signed the receipt. The drive home was quiet. But inside my head, it was deafening. This constant loop of, this is it. This is the last straw. You are never going to get back the version of him who actually saw you. That night, I lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling fan, and something in me finally snapped. But not in the dramatic, screaming way I always imagined. It was more like a cold, quiet decision sliding into place. I couldn't stop him from chasing whatever he thought he was chasing with that woman and her workshops and her inner boy healing. But I could stop myself from sitting there, waiting for him to choose me. So the next morning, before I could talk myself out of it, I called a lawyer during my lunch break. I Googled family law in my city, clicked on the first result that didn't look terrifying, and told the woman who answered that I thought my husband was about to blow up our marriage in the name of personal growth, and I needed to know my options. The lawyer was calm. In that way people get when they're used to watching lives fall apart before noon. She asked questions, how long we'd been married, almost 5 years, if we had kids, we didn't, what our financial situation looked like, and whether there had been any physical abuse. There hadn't, just the emotional neglect kind that doesn't leave bruises, but still leaves marks. She explained how divorce worked in our state, the waiting periods, how property division generally played out. And she told me very clearly, you don't have to tell him about this call yet, but you do need to start protecting yourself. And hearing that from someone who didn't know me, made it feel less like betrayal and more like survival. So that's what I did. I went to a nearby credit union after work and opened a personal checking account, my hands still shaking as I signed the forms. I transferred half of our emergency savings into it that same day, enough that I wouldn't be completely stranded if he suddenly decided to move out and leave me with the rent and the bills. I took screenshots of our joint accounts, printed statements for the last year, hunted down old tax returns, and slid everything into a plain folder that I tucked under a stack of boring clinic training manuals in my home office. It was the most practical act of self-respect I'd taken in years. And I did it with my heart pounding, because I still couldn't quite believe I was actually preparing to leave the man I'd once thought I would grow old with. On the drive home that night, I kept waiting for some big, cinematic feeling to hit me. Like relief, or empowerment, or whatever those self-help podcasts are always talking about. Instead, I just felt tired. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sounds it makes when it cools down. I thought about the version of us that existed when we first got married. The one where we were broke, but still holding hands in grocery store lines and laughing about how we'd tell this story someday when things got better. It hit me that there would never be a neat little bow on this. No moment where I'd say, oh, that's why it all happened. Sometimes, things just fall apart in slow motion. And the bravest thing you do is quietly sign your name on a set of forms and decide you're done bleeding out in the dark. While I was digging through the file cabinet in the office, looking for the tax forms, I found a folder I didn't recognize at first. It was labeled with his handwriting, Class of 2018. And it was tucked behind some old paperwork, like it had been jammed there in a hurry. I opened it, expecting maybe some random certificates or a schedule. But what I found was a glossy photo of him at his graduation, younger and a little skinnier, with his arm wrapped around a woman whose face I recognized even with the years between the picture and now. She was laughing, leaning into him like she belonged there. And on the back of the photo, in his handwriting, it said Graduation Day. With a K. The initial was the same as his coach's first name. I just stood there in the office with that picture in my hand and this weird buzzing in my ears. It's not like I had never considered that maybe they were more than coach and client. But seeing her like that, younger, wrapped around him on a day that was obviously important to him, made my stomach drop in a completely different way. This wasn't some random woman he'd met at a workshop 9 months ago. This was someone he had history with. Someone he had chosen to never mention in all the years we'd been together. I slid the picture back into the folder, then took it out again, then finally slipped it into the side of my purse. Because some part of me already knew it was going to matter later, even if I didn't yet know how. A week after I found the photo, I signed up for a Pilates class. A week. After that, I went back to my lawyer and officially filed the divorce papers. I didn't tell my husband. I just let him keep talking about openness and growth, while I quietly built my exit. That probably sounds random, in the middle of all this, but it was honestly the only thing that stopped me from spiraling completely. I'd been feeling like my body belonged to someone else for a while. Like I was just this moving task list in Scrubs. And I needed something that was just mine. Something that made me feel like there was still a person inside all the panic. The class met 3 mornings a week before work. And the first time I went, I almost left halfway through because I felt ridiculous trying to balance on a mat while a peppy instructor told us to connect with our cores. But then I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, hair messy, cheeks flushed, and I thought, there you are. I haven't seen you in a while. Meanwhile, my husband's absences ramped up. He started coming home late 4 nights a week. Always with some version of, we ran over in group, or Brad wanted to debrief, or my coach needed to process something from her own past and asked if I could stay. I'd hear the garage door creak open close to midnight and lie there in the guest room, counting his footsteps, wondering if he was going to stop at my door or just go straight to the bedroom we used to share. Most nights, he didn't stop. When he did, it was like he was visiting a neighbor, leaning in the doorway to ask if I was okay, saying he hoped I was really thinking about the open relationship thing, because it could be really beautiful for us. I wanted to scream at him that he was confusing beautiful with convenient for you. But all I usually said was that I was still processing. Around that time, a coworker from the clinic invited me to dinner at her place. She and her partner were hosting a small get-together with some friends, and she said I looked like I needed a night that didn't involve listening to other people's medical complaints. I almost said no. Because I was tired and sad and didn't feel like being anyone's entertainment. But then I remembered that my options were either sit alone in the guest room scrolling through photos of my own wedding until I cried myself to sleep, or eat normal food with normal people. So I forced myself to say yes. I told my husband I had plans that Friday, and watched his face flicker for a second, like it hadn't occurred to him that I might have a life outside being the stable background character in his journey. At the dinner, I ended up across the table from a friend of their friend, a professor who taught at a local college. He was funny in this understated way, more awkward than charming, which honestly felt safer than the polished charisma I'd been seeing every time I accidentally watched my husband's coach's videos. We talked about everything except my marriage at first. Work horror stories, weird students he'd taught, how he once did a whole lecture with his shirt inside out and didn't realize until the end. At some point, he asked how long I'd been with my husband, and I said, since right after his college graduation. And he frowned a little. Really? I thought he said you two met a year later. On the surface, it was one of those totally normal, grown-up evenings with mismatched plates and a casserole that someone apologized for even though it tasted fine. Under the table, though, my leg wouldn't stop bouncing. I kept catching myself comparing the way the professor listened when I talked to the way my husband had started glazing over halfway through any sentence that wasn't about his latest breakthrough. The professor asked follow-up questions, laughed at the right spots, and did this thing where he paused before answering, like he was actually considering his words instead of pulling some slogan off a podcast. I'm not saying there were fireworks, or that fate sat down at the table with us. Nothing like that. It just felt like the first time in a long time that I was sitting across from someone who was interested in me. Not in how I could fit into their idea of themselves. It was such a small thing, but it hit me like someone had yanked a loose thread I didn't even know was there. I laughed it off and said maybe I was remembering wrong, but that comment stuck in my head like a splinter. When I got home that night and sat in the driveway, scrolling through my messages, I ended up on my husband's tablet. My phone was dead, and I wanted to distract myself instead of marching into the house and demanding answers. He'd left his account logged in from earlier. And I know. I should have logged out and minded my business. But after months of half-answers and coached phrases, curiosity had turned into something more like self-defense. I didn't go digging through everything, but the first message thread I saw was with his coach, of course. I tapped it, and there it was, a string of warm, intimate messages that were absolutely not what you'd expect between a professional and a client. There were emojis and late-night confessions, and one voice note transcription that said, "It feels just like the old days, you know, before we let everything get so complicated." She had sent him a picture of some campus building with the caption, "Remember this corner?" And he had replied, "How could I forget?" And then there it was, that same tight feeling in my chest, only sharper this time, because now I had the photo from his folder and these messages, overlaying each other like two transparencies on a lightboard. I sat there in the dark garage with the tablet glowing in my lap, my heart racing, trying not to throw up. It wasn't just that he was emotionally cheating on me, although that would have been enough. It was the realization that our entire origin story, the way I had always told it to people, might have been edited by him to cut out an entire chapter he didn't want me to know about. He hadn't just found a random coach who saw him, he had found his ex, or whatever she was, and asked her to guide him through his growth, while I washed the dishes and tried to remember the last time he had asked about my day. I wish I could tell you that I stormed inside and confronted him with all of that right then. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the tablet, put it back exactly where I had found it, and went upstairs to the guest room. I lay awake most of the night staring at the wall, replaying every cute little story he had ever told me about his college days, and trying to see where she might have been hiding between the lines. By the time the sun came up, I had decided two things. 1. I was done pretending I didn't know what was going on. 2. If he wanted honesty and transparency so badly, he was going to get it. Just not in the direction he expected. A few days later, I met the professor from the dinner for coffee. Before you judge me, let me just say that I wasn't planning some revenge affair. I could barely keep up with my own emotions, let alone add someone else's to the mix. I just wanted to talk to someone who wasn't already part of my mess, someone who had seen my husband from the outside and might help me make sense of this version of him I clearly didn't know. I was honest with the professor about the basics. I told him my marriage was falling apart, that my husband had a life coach who seemed a little too involved, and that I had recently discovered they had history. I left out the tablet messages and the photo for the moment, not because I wanted to lie, but because saying all of it out loud felt like asking a stranger to hold my entire nervous system in their hands. He listened. Really listened. In that way where he didn't interrupt me except to ask clarifying questions. And when I finished, he said something that stuck with me. He said, people in authority positions who blur boundaries like that, they always tell themselves they're doing it for your growth, but usually they're just using you to work through their own unresolved stuff. Then he admitted that he had gone through a divorce where a therapist had crossed lines with his ex, and he still had trouble trusting anyone who claimed to be a guide. That should have been my cue to keep my distance, because clearly we were both walking around with loaded emotional baggage. But instead, it made me feel less alone. We started texting after that. Nothing flirty at first, just little check-ins and memes about work. He was cautious whenever I brought up my husband. And when I told him about the open relationship suggestion, he went quiet for a whole day before finally replying that he was worried about me jumping into anything with him while things were that unstable. I hated that he was right. I also kind of loved that he said it anyway, even though it would have been much easier to just play the comforting outsider and slide into the open slot my husband was creating. Around the same time, I made a mistake at work and told one of my coworkers that I suspected my husband and his coach had known each other in college. I didn't mean to spill that much. It just slipped out when she asked why I seemed so distracted. Her eyes lit up in that way people's eyes do when they smell a story. And she said, "Wait, what's her name?" I told her. And she said she could do some digging online if I wanted, because she used to work in marketing and had this whole background in searching people's old posts. Part of me knew this was possibly a terrible idea that would only bring more pain. But another part of me was tired of living in half shadows. So, I nodded and said, "Sure, if you have time." By month 4 of all this, my body had changed enough from the Pilates and the stress that even my husband noticed. One night, he came home earlier than usual and found me in the kitchen in leggings and a tank top, hair thrown up, making pasta because I was too tired to cook anything elaborate. He looked me up and down in this way he hadn't in months and said, "Wow, you look different." I said, "Different how?" And he said, "I don't know, just stronger." I guess the way he said it made something in me want to laugh and slap him at the same time. Because here he was, the man who had basically pulled the plug on us and floated off in a cloud of freedom, suddenly noticing that I still existed. Then, in the most ironic move of all, he got jealous. He started asking more questions about where I was going when I left the house, who I was seeing, whether I had met anyone through my classes, like Pilates was some underground dating ring. This from the man who had just asked for a relationship where he could sleep with whoever he wanted, as long as he wrapped it in spiritual language. One night when I said I was grabbing coffee with a friend after work, he asked, "Is it a guy?" And when I didn't answer right away, he said, "You know, if we're going to do this open thing, we should at least be honest about it." I just looked at him and said, "We are not doing anything. You are doing whatever you want. I am making plans." That was around the time I decided I was done playing defense. If he wanted transparency, I was going to give it to him in one very focused, brutal dose. I told him I wanted to have everyone together for dinner. Him, me, his coach, and a friend of mine, so we could talk openly about what he wanted and what this new version of our relationship was supposed to look like. He immediately looked panicked, which told me everything I needed to know. He said his coach didn't usually mix personal and professional spheres like that, which was hilarious coming from a man who was clearly mixing their bodies. But I kept my face neutral and said I thought, given how deeply she was involved in his inner life, it only made sense that we be in the same room at least once. He stalled. He tried to convince me it would be awkward and unnecessary. He said I was being dramatic. And I calmly kept repeating that I thought honesty was a value he cared about. Now, I even quoted one of his coach's lines back at him, about radical transparency being the foundation of real intimacy. He did not appreciate that. After a few days of tense silence, he finally sighed and said, "Fine, I'll ask her." When he came back and said she had agreed, something in me settled. I texted the professor and asked if he would come, not as my boyfriend, because he wasn't, but as a witness of sorts. Someone who knew enough of the story to understand what was about to go down. He hesitated. A lot. Said he didn't want to be dragged into drama. But in the end, he said yes. Because apparently, I have a talent for pulling decent people into disasters that aren't technically theirs. On the day of the dinner, I cooked like I was prepping for a holiday. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because the motions were familiar and gave my nervous energy something to do besides explode. I made roasted chicken, vegetables, salad, even dessert. All the things I used to make when my husband and I were actually happy and had friends over without secret agendas. The whole time, I kept touching the inside pocket of my cardigan, where I had tucked the graduation photo. Just knowing it was there made me feel less crazy, like I wasn't walking into this armed only with vibes and suspicions. I kept stopping in the middle of chopping or stirring because my brain would flash through every possible version of how the night could go. In one version, she denied everything and made me look crazy. In another, she admitted it all, and they walked out together, leaving me with a sink full of dishes and a life I didn't recognize. There was also the tiny, ridiculous version where he broke down sobbing and begged for forgiveness. But even in my imagination, I couldn't make that one feel real. I checked the seating about 5 times, moving the chairs around like that would somehow change the emotional geometry of the situation. I even cleaned the guest bathroom, which no one ever used, because somehow the idea of her judging my hand soap felt like the last indignity I could control. The professor arrived first, holding a bottle of wine and looking like he wanted to teleport out of his own body. He was wearing a simple shirt and jeans, nothing fancy, which I appreciated because it made the whole thing feel less like some staged reality show. We made small talk in the kitchen until my husband came down the stairs in a shirt that was way too formal for the occasion. Like he was going to a job interview instead of a confrontation. His hands were twitching and he kept fussing with his collar, which told me this was not, in fact, the confident, enlightened man he pretended to be in his group chats. Then she arrived. The coach. She walked in like she owned the place, which, emotionally speaking, she kind of did at that point. She hugged my husband first, pressing her body against his in a way that would have been inappropriate even if she had truly just been his coach. And then she turned to me with a bright, open smile. "You must be Kira," she said, like she hadn't been living rent-free in my marriage for the better part of a year. I shook her hand and said, "Thank you for coming." Which was probably the most restrained sentence I have ever spoken in my life. She glanced around at the house, at the photos on the walls, the couch we picked out together, and then her eyes landed on our wedding picture. She laughed this little laugh and said to my husband, "You looked almost as handsome there as you did at graduation." And I swear the air in the room shifted. She went on talking about some old band he used to love, making a comment about how she was surprised he hadn't framed that poster from his dorm. And every sentence was another tiny proof that they hadn't met at a random workshop last year. They had lived entire seasons of their lives together before I even knew his name. We sat down to eat, and for the first few minutes, everyone pretended this was normal. The coach launched into one of her speeches about freedom and conscious relating, talking about how monogamy is a social construct and how some people are just meant to love more expansively. My husband nodded along like a bobblehead, occasionally adding his own comments about how he'd been doing the work and confronting his fear. The professor stayed mostly quiet, sipping his drink and watching the dynamic like he was observing some rare species. I listened. Smiled. Refilled people's glasses. And waited. At some point, she started describing how their coaching relationship had evolved, how he had come to her feeling stuck and numb, how she had seen the spark in him that reminded her of the guy she knew years ago. She caught herself at that last part, but it was already out there. I put my fork down, reached into my cardigan, and pulled out the photo. I set it in the middle of the table, face up, and watched the color drain from both their faces at the same time. "Do you want to try that part again?" I asked, my voice weirdly calm. "Or should we just admit we've all been telling different versions of the same story?" For a second, nobody moved. Then my husband reached for the photo like he could magically erase it. But I put my hand over his and said, "Leave it." I looked at the coach and said, "You and I have never had a real conversation, so let me ask you something directly. Did you ever disclose to me that you and my husband were together in college before you started taking his money as your client and rearranging his entire life?" She opened her mouth like she was about to give a speech, then closed it again. Then finally said, "It was a long time ago. It didn't seem relevant." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Not relevant?" I repeated. "The fact that you are his ex, and now his spiritual guide who encourages him to have an open marriage, is not relevant to the wife paying half the bills in the house where he's trying to implement your theories?" My husband started stammering something about how he had meant to tell me but never found the right moment. And I turned to him and said, "You didn't want to tell me because you knew exactly what it would look like." By the time we sat at that table, it had been 2 months since I signed the divorce papers. Then I did the one thing he didn't see coming. I told them both that I had already filed for divorce 2 months ago. I told him I had moved money, talked to a lawyer, started building a life that didn't involve waiting for him to decide whether I was worth full loyalty or just partial commitment, while he chased a reunion with his past. The coach looked furious. Not because she cared about me, obviously, but because the story she had built for herself, the one where she was the liberator and not the wrecking ball, was crumbling. My husband looked like someone had knocked the breath out of him. He asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "You don't get to act surprised that I kept something from you, when you have been rewriting our entire history without asking my input." The professor stood up then and said he was going to go, that this seemed like something we needed to handle as a family. He sent me a text later apologizing for leaving, saying he had frozen because it reminded him too much of his own divorce, and he didn't trust himself not to project. I told him I understood. The truth is, I didn't need him there to finish what I had started. That dinner was not about him. It was about me finally saying out loud everything I had been swallowing for months. After he left, things got ugly in a different way. The coach dropped the professional mask completely. She looked at me and said, "You have to understand, I knew him before all of this. Before the job and the house and this version of him. He was mine first." That word, mine, hit me like a slap. She said that he had always struggled with living up to his family's expectations, that he had broken things off with her back then because his parents didn't approve of her. And that he had admitted in sessions that marrying me had been his way of choosing the path they wanted for him, not necessarily the one his heart wanted. I don't know if you have ever had the experience of realizing that the story you thought you were living was not the one the other person was in. It feels like the floor giving out from under you. I asked my husband if that was true, if he had ever told his therapist, his coach, his ex, whatever she was, that I had been the compromise. He didn't deny it. He just said quietly that he had loved me in his own way, that I had been good to him, and that he had hoped the rest would catch up. I told him I was not a retirement plan, and if he had wanted to marry his unfinished feelings, he should have done that instead of dragging me into his attempt at being the good son. The coach admitted that the workshop where they had reconnected was not an accident either. She had found out where he worked, arranged to be hired by a friend's company to run a team-building session there, and made sure he would be in her group. She said it like it was some grand romantic gesture, not a calculated move to re-enter his life under the guise of professional growth. She tried to argue that he had agreed voluntarily to the coaching, to the group, to everything that followed. And she was right. He had. Nobody forced him to answer her messages at midnight or to send her money for private sessions on top of what he already paid through the company. The more they talked, the clearer it became that I was not the villain in their story. I was the obstacle. I was the thing he had to step around to feel like he was reclaiming some old version of himself. And she was the one encouraging him to do it, telling herself it was about authenticity and not just what she wanted. At one point, I asked her, "If you two are such soulmates, why did you not just tell him to leave me and be with you? Why did you need me to be the one to stretch so you could both feel morally superior about it?" She didn't have a good answer for that. She said something about not wanting to be the reason for a breakup, which was hilarious considering she was absolutely the reason. She just didn't want the label. Eventually, my husband told her to leave. Not because he was defending me, I noticed that. It was because he was losing control of the narrative. He had wanted to ease me into this, to get me to agree to an open marriage so he could have both of us without feeling like the bad guy. Now that I had pulled the curtain back, his big experiment in conscious love looked exactly like what it was. A man trying to avoid making a choice. After she left, slamming the door behind her, he sat at the table with his head in his hands. I cleaned up the plates, because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. Eventually, he looked up and asked, "Is there anything I can say to change your mind?" I said, "About the divorce?" "No." "About how you treat women like extras while you chase your nostalgic fantasy?" "Also, no." He said he had never meant to hurt me like this, which is the kind of sentence people say when they haven't thought about anyone's pain but their own until the consequences show up. A couple of days later, my coworker texted me and asked if I could meet her after work. I thanked her, genuinely, for caring enough to dig when I had been too scared to look myself. She said she had found something and didn't want to send it in a message. We sat in her car outside the clinic, and she showed me screenshots of old posts from his account on another social media platform, the kind he barely uses anymore. Years ago, around the time he would have been graduating, he had posted about this woman, calling her the love of his life, talking about how sometimes love is not enough when everyone expects you to follow a certain path. The last post before our relationship started was him saying that he was choosing stability, that sometimes you have to let go of a wild love for something more solid. Reading those words felt like someone holding my face up to a mirror I had been avoiding for years. It wasn't just that I hadn't been his first choice. It was that he had basically written an entire essay about choosing the sensible option over the person he actually wanted. And I had never read the fine print. I cried in my car for a long time after that. Not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, but the quiet, exhaustive kind where your chest hurts and your eyes burn, and you feel stupid for being surprised. It was like all the little doubts I had pushed aside over the years had finally lined up and formed a sentence I couldn't unsee. When I told my lawyer about the financial stuff, she looked even more serious than usual. There were transfers from our joint accounts to his coach's business for consultations that didn't add up with the sessions he had told me about, plus a few big charges at restaurants on nights when he claimed he had been at late group meetings. She explained what could and could not be considered marital waste in our state. And we started the paperwork to make sure he couldn't just drain everything before the divorce was final. It was not some big courtroom drama. No screaming matches in front of a judge. Just forms and dates and this steady march toward the official end of something that had already emotionally ended months before. At home, things were weirdly quiet. He stopped pushing the open marriage idea. Maybe because the illusion had already blown up, or maybe because his coach had gone radio silent. I found a receipt in his jacket one day for an expensive dinner, dated 2 nights after the confrontation. When I asked where he had been that night, he said he had gone to meet some guys from the group. I said, "Did the guys from the group start wearing perfume and ordering dessert to share?" And he didn't answer. We slept in separate rooms, tiptoeing around each other like roommates who had had a massive fight and were waiting for the lease to end. I kept seeing the professor, but less often. When I told him about the dinner, about the photo, about the posts, he looked genuinely horrified on my behalf. And then he admitted that it scared him how obsessed I sounded when I talked about it. Not obsessed like I wanted my husband back, but obsessed with making sense of every single detail. He said he understood why, that he had done the same thing when his ex left him for their therapist. But he didn't want to be the next thing I hung all my hopes on. It stung to hear that, mostly because it was fair. We agreed to slow down, to not slap a label on whatever was happening between us. It wasn't exactly romance, not exactly friendship. More like two people holding each other's hands while walking past the same car crash from different angles. One night, a few weeks before the final court date, I found my husband in the kitchen looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was hunched over the counter, staring at an empty mug. I almost walked away, but something made me stop. He said my name without turning around. And when I asked what he wanted, he said, "I need to tell you something, and I know it doesn't fix anything, but I don't want you to leave without hearing the full truth from me at least once." I leaned against the door frame and told him to go ahead, because at that point, what else was there to lose? He told me everything I already knew, and then some. He admitted that he had never really gotten over his college girlfriend, that he had broken up with her after his parents made it clear she was not their idea of a good match. He said marrying me had felt like the right thing at the time. That he had genuinely thought love could grow on top of safety, and that in some ways it did. He said he had loved our life, our routines, the way I always remembered the small things he needed. But that there had always been a part of him that wondered, what if? When he saw his ex again at that workshop, he felt like he had been handed a second chance. And instead of being an adult and ending things cleanly, he tried to build a bridge between the life he had and the one he thought he missed. He admitted that the open relationship idea had been mostly her suggestion, that she had convinced him it was the evolved solution, the way to honor all his feelings without blowing up his world. He said he had known, even as he pitched it to me over greasy food, that it was selfish. But he went through with it because the alternative was losing one of us, and he didn't know how to do that. Hearing him lay it out like that did not make me feel better. If anything, it made the insult more precise. I told him I would have respected him more if he had just said, "I want to be with her," and asked for a divorce, instead of dressing it up as my opportunity for growth. He started crying then. Really crying. For the first time since this whole mess started. I wish I could say it moved me, but mostly I felt numb. I told him I accepted his honesty, but that it didn't change the fact that he had spent years treating me like something guaranteed while still aching for someone else. He asked if there was any version of the future where we could rebuild trust. I said I didn't know about the future, but in the present, the answer was no. A few nights later, he moved out. He took his clothes, his toiletries, some books, and left the big furniture and the kitchen stuff, which somehow made me even angrier, like he was leaving me with the props from our old life as a consolation prize. One of the guys from the group called me once, weirdly, to say that my husband had shown up at one of their meetings in bad shape, that the coach had cut him off, canceled the men's group, deleted her public accounts, the works. Apparently, she had decided he was too messy, too not evolved enough for her image. I listened, thanked him for letting me know, and hung up. There was some bitter part of me that felt a tiny flicker of satisfaction knowing that the grand love story she had been writing in her head had not exactly worked out either. But mostly, I just felt tired. By the time the divorce hearing rolled around, I was more emotionally drained than nervous. It was a simple thing, really. We signed papers. The judge asked a few basic questions. The lawyers spoke in their soft courtroom voices. And that was it. Our marriage was officially over. He didn't contest the division of property. He didn't argue about the money I had moved, probably because he knew he had already spent more than that on his midlife spiritual crisis. Afterward, in the hallway, he tried to say he was sorry again. And I stopped him. I said, "You are sorry because it hurts, not because you finally understand what you did. Maybe one day you will, but I don't have to be around for that." I sold the house, or our portion of it, and found a small place in a quieter town about 2 hours away. My coworker from the clinic helped me pack, filling boxes while I answered calls and tried not to cry every time I pulled another wedding photo out of a drawer. It wasn't some magical fresh start. Just a different grocery store, different streets, a different clinic that needed someone to manage appointments and calm down people who think the world is ending because the doctor is running behind. I took the job because it paid okay and let me work partially from home, and because routine felt like the only thing holding me together. The first few months there were a blur of unpacking, working, sleeping, and occasionally staring at the wall, thinking about how it was possible to feel both relieved and hollow at the same time. I started learning the new town in small, practical ways. Which gas station had the cheaper coffee? Which route to the clinic had the least awful morning traffic? Which neighbor always left their trash can in the middle of the sidewalk? On weekends when the professor wasn't there, I would walk around with my headphones in and stare at the houses, making up stories about the people who lived in them. Maybe that couple on the corner had gone through something like this years ago and just never talked about it. Maybe the woman 2 doors down had also once packed up her life into mismatched boxes because she finally realized she was the only one fighting to keep it together. It sounds dramatic when I say it out loud, but when you're rebuilding from the ground up, your brain will grab any tiny piece of proof that other people have survived worse and kept going. The professor visited a few weekends. Somewhere between the second and third visit, we stopped pretending we were just having coffee and talking. It wasn't some grand romantic moment. We were both too exhausted and bruised for that. It was more like 2 people reaching for each other in the dark, because being alone felt worse than risking more pain. We tried to see if whatever was between us could be something more in a life that was not constantly on fire. Sometimes it felt easy, like we were just 2 people who liked each other and enjoyed talking. Other times, the shadows of our past sat down at the table with us and wouldn't shut up. He would flinch when I raised my voice even slightly. I would spiral when he needed space and didn't answer a text right away. We fought about stupid things and then over-apologized because neither of us wanted to be the one who triggered the other's trauma. It was messy. And honestly, that made it feel more real than the curated perfection my ex's coach had always preached. Then, I found out I was pregnant. I'd missed a period before from stress, so at first I didn't think much of it. But when my chest hurt and I felt nauseous every morning for a week, I bought a test at a drugstore and took it in my tiny bathroom, fully expecting it to be negative so I could go back to Googling weekend trips to the beach I would probably never actually take. When the little line appeared, I sat on the edge of the tub with the stick in my hand and said out loud, "You have got to be kidding me." I called him while I was still sitting on the bathroom floor. He answered on the second ring, and I didn't even say hello. I just blurted out, "I'm pregnant." And then started crying before he could respond. He drove the 2 hours to my place that night and showed up at my door with groceries and this terrified look on his face like he had just been told he was about to go to war. I'm not proud of that first reaction, but I promised I would be honest. The professor took the news better than I did, at least on the surface. He said we would figure it out, that we didn't have to rush into any decisions about us, that the baby didn't have to mean we were suddenly a perfect little family, but we needed to be responsible. I appreciated his honesty, even when it made me angry. Part of me wanted him to say, "I love you. We've got this. It's all going to be fine," even if it was a lie. Another part of me had learned the hard way what happens when you build your life on someone else's fantasies instead of the reality they are actually capable of. Pregnancy is weird, even when you're in a stable relationship. In my situation, it felt like my body was carrying both a new beginning and the echo of every bad decision I had made. Some days, I would put my hand on my growing stomach and feel this rush of protectiveness, like, whatever happens, you are my person now. Other days, I would stare at my reflection and think about all the ways I could mess this child up if I didn't heal at least some of my own damage. I started seeing a therapist. A real one this time. With actual credentials and clear boundaries. She didn't give me inspirational quotes. She gave me questions I didn't want to answer and homework I didn't want to do. And slowly, painfully, it helped. I had heard through mutual contacts that he had moved back to his hometown, closer to his parents. People said he was in real therapy now, the kind with an actual licensed professional instead of an ex-girlfriend with a certificate from a weekend seminar. Someone mentioned he had quit his old job and was working for his father's business, which felt like the ultimate irony to me, running back to the safe path his parents had wanted after blowing up his life trying to escape it. My ex texted me when he found out about the baby. I hadn't told him directly. Word got back to him the way it always does in families like his, through relatives and friends and whatever informal news network they have going. He wrote, "I heard you are having a baby. I am happy for you. You will be an amazing mother." Then, after a pause, another message. "I am sorry I was not the partner you deserved." It would be nice to say I didn't cry reading that, but I did. Not because I wanted him back, but because it was the closest he had come to acknowledging that I was not just the stable choice. I was a person he had hurt. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say that would not drag both of us back into a conversation that had already eaten enough of my life. The coach never reached out. Sometimes I would see a familiar face pop up on a suggested connection list on some app, and my heart would race, but it was always someone else. Rumor had it that after a few months she moved to another state and started over with a slightly different brand name, new followers, new clients. I'm sure there's a whole new group of people out there now being told that comfort is the enemy of growth, while she lines up their pain with her own and calls it fate. It used to make me furious to think about that. Now it just makes me tired. Almost a year had passed since that night at the restaurant with the fajitas. A year of discovery, confrontation, divorce, moving, and somehow, new life. My daughter was born on a cold day in winter. Labor was long and messy and not at all like the serene birth stories people post online. The professor was there, holding my hand, looking as terrified as I felt. When they finally put her on my chest, she was tiny and loud and absolutely perfect in that scary way where you suddenly realize you are responsible for a whole human being's life. I named her after my grandmother, the one person in my family who had ever shown me what unconditional support actually looked like. When I said her name out loud for the first time, I felt something inside me settle in a way nothing else had in months. The nights after we came home from the hospital were a blur of feeding and crying and me forgetting where I had set down my phone every 10 minutes. There were moments at 3 in the morning where I would sit on the couch with her on my chest, cartoons playing on mute in the background, and think, this is it. This is the part no one can really prepare you for. Not just the exhaustion, but the way your brain keeps trying to run its old programs while your whole life has been quietly rearranged around this tiny person. Sometimes I would catch myself wondering what my ex was doing in those exact moments. Was he sleeping through the night in his parents' house, pretending he hadn't almost blown up 3 lives because he couldn't let go of his past? Was the coach somewhere in another state, telling a room full of people that they needed to trust their desires while conveniently skipping the part where those desires might land on someone else's marriage? It was petty, I know, but those thoughts showed up between diaper changes and bottle washes, whether I invited them or not. Being a mother did not magically heal all my wounds. I still got triggered. Still had days where I resented everyone who had ever lied to me. Still had moments where I caught myself wanting to check my ex's profiles just to see if he looked miserable enough. But holding my daughter gave me a different kind of anchor. It made all the boundary work feel less theoretical. When you have a tiny person watching you, even before they understand language, you start thinking about what you are modeling when you let someone treat you like an option. I don't mean I suddenly became some fierce warrior who never doubted herself. I still second-guess things. I still overthink. I just have less tolerance now for stories that require me to shrink. The professor and I are still figuring ourselves out. Some days we feel like a team, trading off baby duties and laughing at how unprepared we both were. Other days we snap at each other over ridiculous things, like who left the laundry in the washer. Because underneath the fatigue, there is still fear. Fear of repeating old patterns. Fear of failing each other. Fear of letting the ghosts of our exes sit at the table between us. We talk about it a lot, probably more than most couples. Therapy helps with that, too. We are not some fairy tale ending, just 2 people trying not to run away when intimacy feels like walking into a room where all the lights are on. Sometimes late at night, when the baby is finally asleep and the house is too quiet, I think about my old life like it belongs to someone else. I can see myself in that blue blouse at the restaurant, trying not to cry while my husband pitched an open marriage like he was offering me a wellness retreat. I can see myself sitting in the car with his tablet, with the photo, with the posts, connecting dots I didn't even know existed. I feel bad for that version of me, the one who thought that being chosen at all meant she was chosen fully. If you're wondering whether I regret marrying him, the answer is complicated. Without that marriage, I wouldn't have my daughter. I wouldn't have half the insight I have now about what I want and what I will never tolerate again. But I do regret how long I stayed in the role of the reasonable one while everyone else around me followed their feelings wherever they went. I regret how many times I told myself to be understanding when what I really needed was to be honest. I used to think closure meant getting a neat explanation from the person who hurt you. A confession that lines up with your pain and makes it all make sense. That's not what I got. What I got was a messy half-truth from a man who still barely knows how to sit with his own shame. A confusing silence from a woman who probably tells herself she did nothing wrong. And 100 little realizations that came way too late. And still, somehow, that has to be enough. Because life doesn't pause and wait for you to solve every emotional puzzle before the next one arrives. Now, when I rock my daughter to sleep and she curls her tiny hand around my finger, I don't promise her that she will never get hurt. That would be a lie. What I promise quietly in my head is that I will not teach her to be grateful just to be invited into someone's life. I will not tell her that stability is the same thing as love. I will not raise her to think that she has to turn herself into the most reasonable, accommodating version of herself to earn basic respect. If I can manage that, even with mistakes, then maybe all this chaos will not have been for nothing. I don't know if my ex ever really understood what he did, or if his coach ever saw herself clearly in the story instead of as the heroine she probably thinks she is. Maybe they both moved on, telling people about the time they bravely pursued their truth and left out the part where someone else had to pick up the pieces. That is their narrative to live with. Mine is different. Mine is the story of how I finally stopped being the middle ground between somebody's past and somebody's fantasy, and started being the main character in my own life. Even when it felt terrifying, even when it meant starting over with a baby on my hip and no guarantee that this version of the story ends neatly. But when I look around at this small, messy life I'm building, it feels like it actually belongs to me, not to someone else's plan. And honestly, after everything, that feels like more than enough. Have any of you ever been blindsided like this, or felt like you were just a background character in someone else's grand plan? What's the biggest betrayal you've ever had to navigate, and how did you finally reclaim your own story? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.